Recording in progress.
All right, great. So good to go for August Q&A. So I've got a couple of questions submitted ahead of time. If, as always, you've got any questions, pop them in the chat. I'll bring you on, and we'll have a chat. We'll talk about them. So getting started, Dylan's got a couple of questions here. We'll start out with his questions on supplementation. So Dylan's curious about supplementation to aid in recovery for lifters who basically work a lot with really physical jobs and don't get as much sleep. So in terms of a hierarchy of things that are going to be really useful for recovery, right? Our two best tools that we have available to us are pretty much always going to be sleep and food, right? Those are, frankly, the ultimate. And everything below that starts to become a smaller and smaller piece to what we're looking for. With that said, there's definitely stuff that we can do that I would argue will help a lot. So at the top here, sleep and nutrition. There's no getting around it. It's 90% of recovery that you're going to do outside of the gym. With that said, in the gym, what we can do is manage your program both in terms of volume and intensity, as well as how often you overload, right? So getting into that, basically, in short, we've got a concept called MEV, or minimum effective volume, and then MRV, which is maximal recoverable volume. So on the lower end, that minimal effective volume is the least number of sets per week, is generally how we'll measure it, that you need in order to be able to progress, right? And not regress, just basically do well with your training, right? On the other end, maximum recoverable volume is the most you can do without overreaching or overtraining to where you actually run out of recovery resources. So naturally, the window for basically how little you can do and how much you can do narrows as you start to pull away from your recovery on the sleep and nutrition side of things. With that said, we can also look at, how often do we overload, right? So often if we're in a cut, for example, or in a deficit, nutrition is, from a theoretical standpoint, not great, because we're not in a maintenance or an anabolic state. We're in a net catabolic state. We're breaking down tissue in order to hopefully lose some body fat, right? Because nutrition isn't supporting full regeneration of all the cells, and we're actually losing a little bit of tissue, again, we'd argue that it's less than ideal. This would be the same if your sleep was off, your main recovery modalities are impaired. So we might go from overloading and having, say, 2 heavy bench sessions a week to maybe only doing a heavy bench session every 5 days, right? And then having a second bench session in there where that kind of pads it out. So over the course of 2 weeks, you might have 3 heavy bench sessions instead of 6, and then that other bench session ends up being, sorry, I got my math wrong there. You might have 3 heavy bench sessions instead of 4, right? If you're doing one every 5 days. So with that said, you'd have an extra light bench session somewhere in there to pad that out, right? So adding in some extra light days so that you're not detraining, but you're spacing out the overload to give yourself more time and room for recovery is really useful. On the supplementation front, legally, I can't suggest that you take gear, nor am I necessarily advocating for it. But if you wanted to know what supplements are going to help with recovery, gear definitely does. Take from that what you will. On top of that, if we look at sleep, what I've found just through coaching and with myself is we have to look at both sleep volume and sleep quality, right? So we could get 8 hours a night of restless sleep, or you could get, say, 6 hours a night of very restful sleep. And I would argue that the 6 hours a night is going to be more productive in the long term. Some supplements that have been pretty useful on the sleep front would be GABA, so GABA, for just overall sleep quality. Melatonin helps if falling asleep is an issue, though a lot of people find that unless they're getting about 8 hours, they tend to be kind of groggy. There's also been some research that's come out in the last couple of years that's shown that melatonin might not be amazing for testosterone as well. But again, if you've got to balance a lot of this stuff out on, if you're getting absolutely no sleep because you can't fall asleep ever versus a small reduction in testosterone, you'd probably be better off with getting some sleep and taking the hit there, or at least using it to re-regulate your sleep patterns, right? In short, the answer to this question is there's probably not a ton of supplements that aren't illegal in most countries, or at least controlled substances in most countries, that are going to really make a meaningful difference outside of things that will help to improve your sleep quality. Naturally making sure that to the best of your abilities, you're dialing in your nutrition as much as you can. So getting adequate protein intake and calorie intake, paying attention to the timing of it as well is going to be useful, right? Moderating your alcohol consumption is also going to help, just in terms of if you're drinking all the time, that's naturally going to impair recovery and probably mess with sleep quality too. So supplement wise, things that have been shown to help with sleep, just recapping: GABA, melatonin. There's some other stuff as well, like ZMA has been useful for some people. Even magnesium can help with relaxation to a degree, but I would really argue that most people should, even if they're in that situation where they're working a lot, should be managing things on the training front and then looking at improving sleep quality if quantity isn't in order. And, that's going to be looking at things more like practicing good sleep hygiene and ultimately just making sure you've got a good bedtime routine. You're trying to maximize the hours that you have, as opposed to looking for more hours in a day, because I'm assuming by the time you've asked this question, you've done that already. Long-winded answer to there's not a ton you can do outside of trying to hone in on the details already, and supplements will make a small difference, but nothing crazy unless you go with some pharmaceutical routes. So with that said, jumping into next question. So next question is on still diet, but on increasing protein intake. So Dylan asked, basically, as you age, do people become more protein resistant, and do they need to increase their protein intake? So the literature these days says about 0.7 grams of protein per pound of body weight up to about 1.1 grams of protein per pound of body weight is going to be adequate for strength training populations, so powerlifters, right? Typically, what we would try to do is err on the side of caution when we're dealing with these situations where there is some anabolic resistance. So as you age, it's normal for it to be harder to gain muscle. Otherwise, everyone who started lifting at 40 would be looking jacked and tan, just as much as all their 25-year-old counterparts, right? So with those recommendations, that 0.7 to 1.1, honestly, the upper end of that has a pretty conservative buffer in there for most people, I would say. I haven't really had an issue with lifters that I've coached really getting to 1.1 or even 1 gram per pound of protein, 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, having seen more benefit going more than that from a muscle gain and recovery standpoint. If you're at that range, you're probably going to be just fine. I would be focusing on making sure you're getting a good amount and good variety of complete proteins, and maximizing your nutrition timing if it's something you're concerned about. Once you've got calories and proteins and fats pretty consistent over the course of a week, all this diet advice is pretty much useless if you're not consistent, if I'm being perfectly honest. So trying to get around that 0.7 to 1.1 if you're concerned about it, or you're a little older, or you're in a calorie deficit, or you're in a particularly challenging period of training, or some combination of those. I would say err a little bit more on the higher side, and that'll just give you a little bit of buffer so that you can be sure that we've got all our bases covered. Ultimately, your body is just going to burn through the extra protein anyways, and it'll convert it to just extra carbohydrates for the most part. So not the end of the world if you have a little bit too much. Okay, next question. Still on protein, is there a limit to how much protein one can have in one sitting? And this will all tie back together actually into Dylan's next question, which is on intermittent fasting and not having regularly spaced meals. So Dylan's question is basically on, basically my thoughts on intermittent fasting, and, having about half of his calories in the evening where he doesn't mind being too dopey and full, and then having, the other half of his calories spread out over the course of the day. So in terms of priorities with diet, right? I'll answer this question with a little bit of a diagram here. So priority one, let's get rid of all this cluster. Okay. So priority one with diet is energy balance. I don't care who you are. I don't care what diet you're on. It's which is your calories, right? Until you've got that sorted, it doesn't matter how many grams of protein you have a day. If you have a protein shake 20 minutes after your workout, if you had a pre-workout before, if you had nothing but fast carbs before, whatever, you have to get your calories sorted first, right? In second place, we need to look at protein intake, and that's pretty much what we talked about a moment ago. So 0.7 to 1.1 grams per pound of body weight. From there, I'd say in a not distant, but further down the list, third is going to be fat intake, and this is around a 1 gram per kilo, or 0.45 grams per pound of body weight minimum for most people. Again, depends a little bit, but this is the ballpark you'd want to be in. More is fine. And then a little bit further down that list, again, spacing things out a little more, is filling the rest of your calories. So this is, let's say you've got a 2,000 calorie diet, you weigh 200 pounds, you have 200 grams of protein a day and 90 grams of fat a day, right? So that's about 800 calories of protein and 800 calories worth of fat. So you've got 1,600 calories, you've got 400 calories left over. How you fill that remaining 400 is largely going to be based on preference, energy levels, performance, and satiety, right? So if you've got 400 calories and you want to have Mars bars because that's what makes you happy and you can perform well that way, cool. Odds are most people are probably going to want some vegetables and fruits and micronutrients in their diet, and some starchy carbs that are going to help with just sort of sustaining performance and aiding in recovery. But if you had 200 extra calories of fat and 200 extra calories of carbs, that's fine, because we're really respecting the number one priority of energy balance, right? The difference between 200 calories of fat and 200 calories of carbs versus 400 calories of carbs is going to be minimal relative to respecting everything further up on this list, priorities 1, 2, and 3, right? So much further down that list, we start to look at timing. Now, as a general rule, most people are going to do well with about 3 to 6 meals. And when I'm saying meals, I mean like feedings, snacks, meals, protein shakes, whatever. And 3 to 6 protein-rich meals per day. What I would recommend if you're going to have half your calories in the evening because you find that your energy through the day and your performance at work and in your workouts is better that way, you find you get sluggish if you eat too much, is really making sure that the meals you're having through the day are protein rich. So you're maintaining a good nitrogen balance throughout the day. And then having the remainder of your calories and carbs and fats in the evening. So as a structure, what personally I found really useful, because I actually follow this pretty closely, I get the same thing. I get pretty dopey if I eat too much during the day, is I'll have breakfast and lunch at pretty normal times. I'll have an afternoon snack before I work out. And then the bulk of my calories end up pretty much in my dinner. About 40 to 60% of my calories for the day end up there. With that said, I'm still aiming for about 20 to 25% of my daily protein intake at each of those other 3 meals. So my protein intake across the day is pretty well distributed. And that means because the meals are a little smaller, I'm ending up with a pretty protein focused meal, just because if I'm having, say, 500 or 600 calories in a meal versus 1800 calories for dinner, in order to get 50, let's say 50 grams of protein in, right? That would represent a much bigger portion of the meal, like 200 calories over a 500 calorie, like 200 calories of protein over a 500 calorie meal would be obviously about 40% of the calories, compared to 200 calories out of an 1800 calorie meal is a bit of a drop in the pond. So I can have proportionately less protein in that meal. In terms of how much of a difference will it make? Well, it's very individual at this point. I would say, I know you, Dylan, so I know that you work out in the evenings primarily. I would say for you, not going to make too much of a difference as long as your energy by the time you get to the workout is good. If you were finding that you were ended up kind of tired by the end of the day before you got to the workout, I'd say looking into having a bit more food slightly before your workout would help, just with bringing energy levels up, or improving your stamina in the workout would help. But again, this is a pretty minor detail relative to just respecting energy balance up top. In terms of protein being able to use in one sitting, the lower end, as far as I'm aware of for literature, is about 20 grams or so per sitting. And that's sort of the lower end of what we're looking at to really spike muscle protein synthesis. Enough where it's a significant spike and we can see some good anabolic effect, right? Muscle building or tissue building. In terms of a higher end, there's not really a limit. I think, at least as far as I'm aware, a lot of that myth came from kind of early 2000s when protein powders started getting pushed pretty hard. And they said, oh, you can only absorb, 25 or 30 grams of protein per sitting, which coincided pretty well with the amount of protein you're going to get in a scoop. And I don't know, it's a little bit tinfoil hat, but that was one of those things that I noticed kind of around the same time that supplements started getting pushed really hard, was about when that myth came out. I don't know if it's fully correlated, but protein absorbs basically at a rate, and there's going to be some certain things that impact that rate of absorption, but different protein sources will absorb at different rates, but there's no hard cap. Yeah, there's not really a big limit where if you had 100 grams of protein at a sitting that you'd only absorb 30. That doesn't really exist too much. So yeah, got covered supplementation and basically how to maximize recovery today with sort of high work, low sleep type situations. We've talked about increasing protein intake with anabolic resistance. We've talked about protein in one sitting, as well as intermittent fasting and nutrition spacing and calorie spacing throughout the day. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. That's all I've got for questions, unless Tommy, unless you've got any other questions. And as always, you can leave your questions down in the chat below or in the comments. If you've got questions, they'll get answered either in a piece of content that I make or on the next Q&A. Okay, perfect. Well, in that case, we'll wrap up for today then. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll talk later. Have a great one. Bye-bye.